you're not just serving the people inside this church, but like you're called to be a shepherd of the Flower Mound Louisville community. And so what does that community need? Does it need food? Does it need, do the teachers need help? Are there parents who can't pay their bills? Like, what does the community need? And that's where the church said, okay, well, that's the most important thing to us because this is our community and that's not going to happen here.
That was the voice of Reverend Gracie Millard, one of our associate pastors at Trietsch Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Welcome to the Life Plus God podcast. My name is Alyssa Robinson. I am your host. And today our big question is, how can Christians engage with social justice? It's one of those really tough questions that when you start to think about it, the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it almost always ends up somewhere political. Mm-hmm. And we get a little, hinky about that. And we don't like it. And it makes us uncomfortable. And we don't like having these conversations. But a lot of the work that the church is called to do around solving homelessness and hunger and serving those who find themselves in prison and all of these things, systems and politics always come into play at one point or another. Yep. And so we're going to have a broad level conversation about social justice, where we see social justice in the Bible, where we can personally engage in social justice. And then we're going to talk about some of those hot button issues. Yeah.
Lucky me.
I know Gracie's very excited about that. Our most non-confrontational pastor around politics and where this comes into play or maybe does not come into play when it comes to political understanding of social activism. Yeah. So that was, man, there's so much to cover.
And there's a lot to cover.
Well, where I really want to start is grounding us in scripture and theology, specifically United Methodist theology, since we're United Methodist. But let's start with just a broad definition. What does social justice mean from a Christian perspective?
So I was looking up the term social justice just to kind of see, because I was getting it confused with social gospel. I don't know if you remember that.
I'm not familiar with that.
I feel like I learned about it maybe in U.S. history. Maybe it was more in Christian history classes, but that sort of came up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually, there's a reason probably I got it confused, is because that term social justice comes up for the first time in the late 1800s from a Jesuit priest. So it inherently in itself is a Christian movement, a Christian practice, I guess. So I defined it myself as like sort of what you were indicating, if politics and social justice will always end up overlapping because it's about people. I think just to its most basic essentials, it's addressing injustices faced by people. When people aren't experiencing the basic rights of individuals of just being a human, if they're not getting food, shelter, healthcare, you name it, freedom, flourishing, the ability to flourish, the ability to move, to grow and succeed in the world. I think that's the basic definition of social justice, is that we're working to build the kingdom of God in that way of overcoming the injustices faced by people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's where the diciness comes in, because then people start to dissect, okay, what's a right versus what's a privilege?
Sure.
Or what is something that is systemic versus something that is personal?
Sure.
So all of these things is where it starts to, we run into a little bit of conflict and conversation of how do we handle these things. And what's difficult is, There is a ministry, a local ministry that the founder of the ministry came out of this church, She Supply, which supplies feminine hygiene products to underserved communities. And one of the taglines of their ministry, which I adore and I quote all the time, is there are no easy problems left to solve. If it was easy, we would have solved it. And so looking at all of these big issues of hunger, healthcare, housing, whatever, they're not easy.
Right.
And that's where there's like all of this angst around. We all agree that we want to, I hope we all agree that we don't want anyone going hungry,
Right.
that we don't want anyone unhoused, that nobody deserves those things.
Right.
But where the politics and the divisiveness comes into play is how are we
How do we
solving
do
for
it?
this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're right. And it's based on people's definitions of what justice is and what, like you said, is deserved or a consequence of actions. And it does get sticky. And so you might be asking me this question later, but one of just naturally starting to think about is that what do you believe Jesus Christ is calling you? What do you believe God, Holy Spirit, is calling you to do as a follower? What is your faith compel you to do? And for different people, it will mean sometimes different things, but I think in general, like you said, generally people all agree, like people should not go hungry. People deserve to have food. People deserve to have housing. But to the degree of how much do we hand to people and how much about meritocracy and all that. So
Yeah. Well, before we get into the how and what Jesus guides us to do,
right.
why is this even important for Christians to engage with? Like, why is social justice something that we need to take a look at if we call ourselves Christ followers?
Well, the first thing when I saw your first question, it made me think, well, we've been doing this before there was a term for it. This is what the church was known for. It was what Christians were known for in the first centuries when Christianity wasn't really a formal, organized religion. They were known as the people who were helping. They were taking in the sick. They were visiting those in prison. They were helping the poor. The Romans in some cities, literally, like some of the Roman officials would just kind of turn a blind eye because Christians were helping the community be peaceful. And so they would kind of be like, I don't know what's going, I don't think there are any Christians around here, but they knew that they were the ones who were helping. It's from the very basis of the Christian movement, you could argue. And so from the very beginning of time, it's been a faith of action, of living out, of going to visit and bring in and share the good news, physical good news to marginalized people.
Yeah, it reminds me of that old church song, which I love. They will know we are Christians by our love. Yeah. And I think so often today we get caught up in the proclamation of Christianity, which is an important element.
Sure.
I'm not discrediting proclaiming Christ, but we focus less on the doing and the action. And will someone know that I am a Christian by the way that I love people, by the way that I help people, by the way that I serve people, you know, all of that.
Right.
And unfortunately, for a lot of people who have been hurt by the church or have been hurt by Christians, they wouldn't guess that you're a Christian if you're loving and helping and serving. They might actually say, oh, they must not be a Christian because they're out doing these things. So I
don't know where along the way we lost the reputation for it, because that social gospel that I brought up, the fact that the word social justice came from the church, the social gospel was the movement that was in reaction to like the Industrial Revolution, where they saw this the conditions that people were living in cities, and children experiencing homelessness, and the need for prison reform. And that all was birthed out of the church, all of it. And so it was called a social gospel because it was heavily involved in changing society. It was Dorothy Day and Walter Rauschenbusch. They were the women's, what do you call them, societies. They were always about, temperance was one of their things. You can think what you want on that. But they were all, these societies, all these movements were based out of Christian teaching, where the church was, we need to do something about this. And they gathered better than anybody. They got that temperance thing to become a law in the Constitution. We know it got changed later, but they were organized as heck.
Yeah. I wonder, like, at what point in history did we become more hands-off? Because I think that there are a lot of people that argue that social justice is more of a political issue than a faith issue. And I'm wondering if it's just like the more politically divisive we become as a country, like religion kind of follows suit. And like a lot of people, the conflict is too much and they're just like checking out of like, well, I can't be merciful, loving, forgiving, gracious if I'm involved in this divisive environment. How would you respond to Christians who feel hesitant to get involved because of this feeling of like, if I'm involved in this political environment, then I'm not able to live out the tenets of Christ?
Yeah. It's a catch-22. It's a tough question because if you get involved, then you are accused of becoming political, and if you're not involved, then you're accused of not living out your faith. I think maybe want to make a distinction of that. Yeah, from the beginning, this social justice has been a political thing, but I think where it becomes partisan is the biggest issue. I was trying to figure out. So correct me if I'm wrong. It seemed like maybe the 80s was when Christians started all becoming. It was more associated that if you're a Christian, then you're going to vote this way versus one way or another. It seemed like groups of people became more associated with different political parties, where before, Christians were all across the spectrum and voting wise. It didn't inform their their political party didn't inform their faith. But anyway, I think it's when the political party started to adopt stances on certain things, it's the fear of being associated with maybe that political party or that stance, because then if you get involved in this, then people might start to think you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, and you don't want that association. You just want to help people, and I don't know if there's a silver bullet to figuring out how to just not care whether, but and it's easier said than done to say what does our faith compel us to do, versus what does my political party compel me to do?
Yeah.
And I know that's obviously easier said than done. But I think I don't want to dismiss that people, that would be difficult to step into that. And I guess maybe I would encourage people to find organizations that aren't politically affiliated, that they're not food pantries who are, we're a red food pantry. No, like there's some that just transcend. You can hope to find ones that transcend the political spectrum, but I don't know.
Well, let's go to the Bible for a second. Shall we?
Let's go to the Bible.
The Bible talks a lot about caring for the oppressed and the marginalized. And so I think as Christ followers, we're all on the same page there of like, let's look out for the people who are most marginalized among us and who are the least served, and let's take care of them. How do you think that those teachings apply to social justice work today? Like, well, I guess before I get to that, are there verses or stories in the Bible that you think speak specifically to the way we view social justice today?
There are several I can think of. I went to Perkins, and they are pretty, they teach you a lot about social justice.
Perkins School of Theology.
Perkins School of Theology,
for people
yes.
who don't know. Yeah.
And so I have all these verses in the back of my pocket. In the Old Testament, we see a lot, I mean, almost all the prophets, the minor prophets, but in the Jeremiah and Isaiah too, there's a lot of the time they're upset about the people not treating the poor well. They're taking advantage of them. They're not helping the widows and children. That's a lot of the time where God is upset and speaking through prophets. So we see that that's what makes God angry. I mean, that's in the 10 Commandments right off the bat, is God telling us how to interact with each other, and that we need to help people. We need to leave, the edges of our land for the people who can't afford it, and to welcome the foreigner. So that's Old Testament, but then Jesus comes and embodies that. And so the most direct text I can think of is the Luke 4, when Jesus is in the temple, goes and reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads from Isaiah 62. I'm telling you, they drilled this scripture into us. And that's when Jesus says, "The Spirit of God is upon me, and I have come. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the release of the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so that's just a very direct way. And then Jesus says that, and today this scripture has been fulfilled.
Yeah. So it feels like in that one sentence, he addresses poverty, he addresses healthcare, he addresses freedom,
Yeah.
he addresses, what else does he address in there? Like big hitters.
Yeah, the poor proclaim release to the captives, sight to the blind, the oppressed go free.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of his thesis statement of, hey, this is why I'm here. And it doesn't get any clearer than that when he literally says, "This is why I am here." And elsewhere when he says, "This is why I'm here," is to proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to all the nations. So Jesus, right off the bat, is like, "Hey, just a heads up, this is why I'm here. I got to show you how to live out this teaching that God has tried to get in your little brains for so long."
How did Jesus participate in social justice? Like, is there anything that we can learn from him from the way that he treated people or served people or was generous with people? It's hard because, like, Jesus himself was unhoused.
Right.
And he was an immigrant, and he was a refugee, and all of these things. And so on paper, he's the person who we're here to serve. But do we see him setting that example for us rather than just saying the words?
Yeah. So one of my favorite stories is in John 8, when he, oh my gosh, helping the woman who was caught in adultery, and the Pharisees bring her to him, and is like, "Hey, we need to arrest her, right? Isn't that what we need to do?"
Rule. Yeah.
And that's when he calls into question. He says, "Hey, well, sure, just let the first of you who hasn't sinned throw the first stone. And that's one of the first signs that, and at the end, he says, nobody has condemned you, neither do I.
Mm-hmm.
Go on your way and sin no more. So that's an instance of calling out an injustice where you see it of like, hey, this person who is pretty much was trapped between a rock and a hard place. You pulled this woman, she's not allowed to speak for herself. So he stands up for her and then calls out, hey, and who are y'all to talk about this?
Yeah. Well, what I like about that story is it's not just a moment of injustice. He's also addressing a system of injustice. And because the Pharisees were trying to trip him up and be like, hey, this is the law.
Right.
Are you going to break the law, Jesus?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it was a test.
Yeah.
And he responded by saying, hey, maybe re-examine that law because you're not living up to it either.
Right.
And so I think what it for me, it gives me permission and encouragement to look at the systems that we have in place and say, how is this system hurting people? How is this system targeting specific people?
Yeah.
And all of that, exactly how that system was targeting that woman and bringing her to, quote unquote justice when she probably did the same thing that half the men in that group had done themselves, but they weren't being brought to justice because they weren't targeted by those laws.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the clearest instances to me. But then the countless times that Jesus heals people, I think that the centurion's daughter where somebody runs to him and says, you need to come. And he's, okay, I'm on my way. And he goes into the house, heals her. All the instances of healing. But every time he had dinner with those who nobody would invite to dinner.
In your ministry, do you have any personal stories that you've seen your faith intersect with social justice in a way that you can illustrate this point for us?
So one of the classes I got to take while I was at Perkins was a winter term class we went to Waco, the booming town of Waco, to talk sort of about social justice. It was a class on social justice, and I think they maybe couched it in urban ministry or something, community building, something like that. And it was to learn about this organization called Mission Waco, where essentially it was just building a community. Using the community's resources to build the community up. And so they have been doing this ministry for 40 years now. And so getting to experience that, one of the tenets of their ministry is the church under the bridge, where they literally have church under the I-35 bridge because that's where people were living. And they said, well, they deserve to get to go to church too. I guess this is an example of me personally living out my faith, but that was a wonderful example to me of social justice ministry, of meeting the people where they are and then not telling them how they need to get help or just trying to get them to convert to Christianity.
You need to turn your life around.
Right. But it was, okay, we're going to live here and build our life here and invest in this community because we know, because these people are children of God too. And they've been stuck in and put in an unfair situation where just based on the town ordinances and, redlining and all of that,
in a situation that once you're in, it's nearly impossible to get out.
And so they're like, well, this is where we feel God calling us to be. And so they've worked to finally have a grocery store that's an affordable and a healthy store in that zip code. So that inspired me, and I realized that I could actually start living that out. So I started serving at City Square, which is over in right outside downtown in West Dallas, in the food pantry, and it felt like I was able to put my faith in action of saying absolutely nobody deserves to have to go hungry. Who knows why you're in this situation? You encountered all kinds of people, and I remember one man who was receiving food that day. I was pushing the grocery cart of his food out with him, and he said, "You are such a blessing. Thank you so much." And I was like, do they ever? And so I told him, you are a blessing. I don't know that they ever get told that the people who receive the help think that they, have to deserve or that they're so grateful. And it's like, of course you deserve this. This is, or you deserve this food because you're a human being. Then you are a blessing. It's not just, I'm not, a savior by any means. I'm just honestly doing the bare minimum here. So I don't know, that always has stuck with me of thinking, how often do they get told like they are gifted and have a blessing? Anyway, that's kind of a side tangent.
Well, no, I think that is part of the intersection of faith and social justice is that relationship building that happens. And it's such an important part of it because I think oftentimes when we're viewing an issue from a distance, some things we'll never fully understand, but until you see something up close and you meet someone who is living in this situation and you can build a friendship with them and get to know them. And
then it's your friend that's experiencing.
It's your friend that's experienced it. And it takes out, the unknown for us generates fear, generates discomfort, like all of these things, because we are it's human nature. Like we are afraid of what we don't know and what we don't understand. And so stepping into the fold and removing that barrier and just building a relationship is like the first step in the intersection of faith and justice. And that's what we see Jesus doing over and over and over again is like, that's exactly what you described for Church Under the Bridge is exactly what Jesus did is like, go where people are, talk to them, be in relationship with them, share life with them and help them. And by doing that, you'll see where they need help and support. Yes. And then you can step in and help rather than just guessing.
Right.
I think that we're guilty of that sometimes as Christians is like we donate our old clothes or whatever it may be from our house to this organization. And that's not what they needed. But we didn't even stop to ask, what is it they need?
Right.
We just wanted to, honestly, it was about me getting rid of things that I didn't want anymore, And so we're just completely cutting out the relationship and the friendship and, building all of that.
That's a better way and shorter way to go through my long convoluted seeing Church Under the Bridge and the ministry that Mission Waco is helped me realize the importance of building the relationships with people and that it was much easier to begin participating in, and I don't know that I even thought it necessarily looked at it as social justice, but just living out my faith and saying, I think people deserve food. I'm going to do what I can.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes my mistake is I love problem solving. And so I get so caught up in solving the problem that and most of these problems are so complex and complicated, one person can't solve it and 100 million people can't solve it. We can't quite figure it out, but I have in my head, well, if I can't solve it, then what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point of even getting involved? And sometimes relationship is the point, and that's the first step toward a solution. If we were all more connected, if we all better understood each other, then I can't imagine that we would never be able to figure out
Right.
how to solve these problems. But
Right.
like we're all trying to do it from a distance.
Right. Yes. And thinking that somebody else will figure it out, or it's, I don't know that much about it. So what help could I'm just one person. What help could I possibly be?
Yeah.
And I know I fall into the same thing because I'm like, for every step forward you get, then you have 2 steps back and you're like, well, why am I even doing this?
Yeah.
It can be really disheartening.
Yeah. Well, and so to step back into the political side of things, one of the issues that I have, and I bring it up because I know relationship is the answer, but it's so difficult to get there, is there are some issues like abortion, for example, where there are 2 clear sides that are the extreme of each side of like what we see as the extreme is like there's pro-life and there's pro-choice,
Right.
and both see themselves as the righteous path when there are upsides and downsides to each side, but there is an unwillingness to even consider the possibility of coming together and having a conversation and figuring this thing out. So, like, how do we approach social justice issues around topics that have become so partisan that it feels like you can't even have a reasonable or love-centered, I'll say, because sometimes love has no reason,
Right.
but a loving conversation around how we can better love and support people.
Yeah, I wish there was a silver bullet.
And I'm not going to make you say whether you're pro-life or pro-choice on this
you.
podcast.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's one of our biggest, I can't think of the right word, losses that we've experienced maybe in the last 10 years of our inability now to have civil conversations with each other when we disagree. And so it's I feel like it's probably just takes practice of getting used to practicing having those conversations. And for many of us, that is with our family members more so than other people, because our family is the people we don't choose that we have to spend time with. But otherwise, we tend to be with mostly people. We tend to choose to spend our time with people who agree with us. But I think, and it's again, all of this is easier said than done, and I don't want it to come across like I, have definitely mastered this. I have not by any means. But I think the name of the game is nuance, and knowing that issues that are painted black and white aren't really black and white. There's always gray area, and assumptions that we make about each other are normally pretty radical way and not fully true, that there's nuance to all of that. So it's hard, but I think it involves taking a position of humility, which is very difficult when the other person doesn't also take the position of humility, because it can come across as just, you might feel like you're getting just walked over. But that might be one of the things is not everybody's willing to have the conversation, and you're just not going to be able to change anybody else's mind. And that's a hard pill to swallow when we believe, especially if we believe our faith is compelling us to do this, and we think that person is also a person of faith. And we're like, how is your faith possibly compelling you to believe that? And
sometimes with conversations I have with people, I'm like, I don't know if we know the same Jesus. Right. Like, I don't know if we worship the same God.
Right. And so I think it comes down to listening and being willing to listen. I think that's the primary thing, is that people want to be heard. And the reason they've chosen to believe something usually is tied to some element of fear or some feeling that they're afraid of something happening. And that's when we get defensive and dig our heels in. But if we can be secure in where we stand, but also be open-handed and open-minded, in receiving, this is why this person has gotten to this conclusion.
Is it important for us to have conversations about these hot button social justice issues? Because I think that, there's always this trope of you don't talk politics, you don't talk money, it's not polite. It's not polite
It's not
to have
polite,
these
right.
conversations. And I think that's where, like, at this church, we often talk about like unity above uniformity,
Right.
of like, we don't need to all agree, but we all need to come together and
Right.
love. But like, that sometimes feels impossible with these
Right.
kinds of topics where like you're just so polar opposite from somebody else, and you're just like, I don't even understand how we're of the same faith.
Right.
How do you mentioned humility, you mentioned listening, all of these things, but how important is it to engage in these conversations, or is it more important to not engage in these conversations and prioritize unity?
And yeah.
Or can you somehow do both? I don't know.
Right. I think ideally we would have both. Ideally we would be able, I think it is important to have the conversations so that we don't grow more polarized from each other. That's the hard thing to do, but I think that's what led to polarization, is that you just keep spending time and leaning into what you believe, and spending time in listening to things that support what you believe. And trust me, I do it too. Like, I'd much prefer listening to what I believe than something that...
Well, when we were talking about when things changed, I completely forgot about the internet, where we can like get exactly the information that we want at any given point of time. And we basically created this handheld echo chamber,
Right.
that can just reflect, and the algorithms on social networks and everything is just reflecting the content that you most want to engage
Right.
with, which is only reinforcing your preconceived biases.
Exactly. And you'd mentioned that the solution to this is relationship, and it is. It's the seeing people as people and not their beliefs. And I'm not saying that we need to have conversations with every single person in our life about this, but I feel like we don't want to engage in conversations with people we don't trust. I think that might tend to be people's fear in having these conversations, is that they're going to lose this person. They're going to, it's going to affect their relationship. So, but if you trust that person loves you and loves you as a person, you would be able to work through it in, an ideal world. So don't say, well, Pastor Gracie said we need to talk about abortion. But I think it is important to express, this comes down to me to basic, just like conflict resolution of I feel, and this is where I'm coming from. And so it's a lot of active listening, and it tends to not really be about the political issue. It tends to be more about something inside.
Like you mentioned before, some deep-rooted fear or...
Right. And so but it's hard when it comes back to feeling like this is what my faith, because I declare Jesus Christ as my Lord of my life, I'm compelled to love this way. And so I guess there's no harm in indicating how you got there. This is, based on my faith in Jesus, and based on this teaching, and based on the relationship I have with the person who is an immigrant, or who is in prison, or who is, experiencing homelessness. This is the conclusion, the most loving conclusion I came to. That's an ideal world, but...
Well, so looking at the church as a whole, how do you think, what is our role or responsibility in addressing social justice, systems of oppression, like things like that, is the church supposed to get involved in politics? Because we also have this whole like separation of church and state thing.
Right.
And like, if you say certain things from the pulpit, you will lose your tax exempt status. And like, there's
Right.
all this like weird stuff in here of like,
Yeah.
how do we, but like when you described the, mid-century churches and all of the social justice work
Yeah.
that they were doing, I'm like,
It
man,
wasn't seen as political. It was just seen as helping the community. And so maybe it's starting at the grassroots level. Maybe that's more what churches should reflect is we're doing this for the good of our community. We are, we see people hurting. Because of our faith. I'm trying to think.
well, and I think part of it is like not qualifying or quantifying people's suffering.
Right.
And I know I'm guilty of that, of like our church is in a affluent community.
Mhm.
And sometimes I look at the way people are suffering and I'm like, come on. Like you make so much, at least you can pay your bills.
Right,
At
right,
least
right.
you have groceries, you have a roof over
Yeah.
your head, all of these things. But that's like prejudice and judgmental of me, because just because you have money doesn't mean you don't have problems and that you're
Sure.
not suffering
Right.
in different ways. You could be suffering mentally, emotionally, like with
Sure.
relationships,
Yeah.
all sorts of ways. And I think that we tend to like grade your suffering and like who's going to get our attention.
And to a degree, we do have to do that.
Yeah.
Which is what gets tricky and difficult of like, what do we, what causes or injustices do we seek to go after?
Yeah.
Because they're all worthy of
Yeah.
being helped and being rectified. And so it's again, a catch-22 of if you don't help this, then you're not helping. If you help this, then you don't have the funds to help something else. But I do feel that the church would not be living out its mission, literally, that Jesus, the purpose of the church, it was never to be a building. It was never to, Jesus never said you need to have worship every Sunday and that's what your faith is. It was always serving other people, living out, building the kingdom of God. And you don't do that if you're not engaging in the community and saying, well, this is the part of the kingdom of God that I'm feel. And, that's what the church, in the United Methodist Church, they say, like, your appointment is to this church, but the community is your parish. That's like the Wesley saying, like, the world is my parish. But saying, like, your charge is to this community. You're not just serving the people inside this church, but, like, you're called to be a shepherd of the Flower Mound, Louisville community. And so what does that community need? Does it need food? Does it need, do the teachers need help? Are there parents who can't pay their bills? Like, what does the community need? And that's where the church said, okay, well, that's the most important thing to us because this is our community and that's not going to happen here.
Yeah.
And so ideally the church would be leading the way in those areas. And it's been tied to the Methodist identity from the beginning, which is one of the things I love most about the United Methodist Church, and the Methodist movement was built from this, not only is your faith a personal holiness that John Wesley talked about, but so, your own spirituality, your own reading and praying, but it's a social holiness that you're growing in your faith. They're like in tandem, that your personal holiness is growing because you're serving and you're visiting the sick and you're, helping the poor and everything. It's not a solitary internal thing, but that this is absolutely that's where there became the name Methodist, is from. There's a method to how we do this, that we do our own personal stuff, but we also do stuff out in the world. Yeah. That's our method.
Well, and I think that there's, social justice, social activism, all of this has to some extent, become a scary buzzword.
Yep.
That has a lot of baggage with it. But I like what you said at the top of this episode, which is social is just people.
Yeah,
Like, and
it's just
that's
people.
it's just people. And like, of course we're called to serve people. And when we see people who are hurting, who are suffering, who are being oppressed, yes, absolutely. Like, our faith calls us to step in and do something.
Yeah.
And I do see it. I know sometimes I come off as really negative and pessimistic,
No.
but I see so much. One of the things that I, was thinking about out of this church specifically is our addiction recovery ministry led by Pastor Doug, where, man, addiction is like an equal opportunity offender, like and addiction is a big part of this community. It's something that we struggle with in so many different ways. And to see that this church has stepped up and said, and during a time that I think that they started having addiction recovery maybe like 15 years ago.
Oh, wow.
But like, it was actually like very, what's the word? Controversial is the word. Yeah, it was controversial in this community that a church was opening up a worship service and a place for people who struggled with addiction to come, because there was fear around this group of people of like, well, I've heard that addicts steal things. I've heard like that, well, yeah, they are constantly smoking and they're not allowed to smoke in the church. Doug's mentioned that on the podcast before, of like, there were all of these fears around hosting a group of people who were addicted to something in this church, and they got a lot of pushback, and there were no other churches really offering this kind of ministry. And so, I mean, kudos to this church for seeing the need and stepping into it and saying, no, we are going to do this. We love these people, and they deserve to experience Christ's love just like everybody else.
Right.
And I think that that's the perfect example of like looking around your community, seeing what people are struggling with, and stepping in to help, because it is going to be different for every community.
Right. Yeah. And on just the basis that I don't think I ever just said it outright, that we say, like, one of the things that we say we believe is that people were made in the image of God. So every single person. So to not qualify what needs are or what's deserving, but just we're all on the basis of just love God and love your neighbor. I don't think I have said that at this point, but it's like, and loving our neighbor is now been rebranded as social justice, which I will die on that hill of that's a Christian. It was a Christian term first. So,
well, one of the things that we talked about was, my problem solver tendencies of like, if I can't solve it, I'm not going to do it, sort of thing. Sometimes social justice work can be exhausting and overwhelming sometimes. All the time. It's exhausting and overwhelming. Like you mentioned, it's like one step forward, 3 steps backwards at all time. How do you encourage people to keep their faith strong and avoid burnout while engaging in this important work? Because it does feel like sometimes of like, okay, we're never going to run out of people who are hungry. We're never going to get every person in a house. We're never like, and it's just this constant revolving door of people who need and need and need.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's where the importance of the community is. That's, I would say, one of the reasons the church exists as an entity is that we are a group of people who all proclaim we believe in this good news that's for all people. And we're going to need each other because we're all going to be ebbing and flowing at different times. And that's why we have each other to rely on. And we're going to need to lean on other people's wins to get us through until we get our next win. And they're going to need our win to help them get through. So I think it's just that constant that constant depending on each other, and being vocal about the wins when you do get them. I love every week or every other week in staff meeting, we always start off with ministry wins, because I can guarantee you not everybody in that room is feeling like working at a church that week.
And it is really encouraging
and it's
to hear
really
like
encouraging.
the stories of people who got connected or felt loved or expressed gratitude or whatever it may be,
Right.
really made an impact. You're like, okay,
Yeah.
we're
It is
doing
making a
something
difference.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's so important to be sharing the stories when they happen to you, or then otherwise, tell me something good that happened. I need good news. And just trading that off with other people in your circle, whoever's your circle.
Well, let's wrap up with advice. What advice would you give to Christians who feel called to make a difference? They want to get started in social justice, but they're afraid of stepping outside of their comfort zones.
Yeah. Usually God does call us out of our comfort zones, unfortunately for us. And nothing, I hate those platitudes, because I personally, just
It's
really,
another easier said than done.
right.
Yeah.
But everything worth having, takes hard work to get there, essentially. And, believing that God is calling you to do something is, well, first a sign of faith that you are sensing this call, and can't shake it, or it keeps coming back. That I say it's an act of faith. It's a leap of faith that you just have to take the next right step, the next step. You don't have to have the whole thing figured out. You're not being asked to solve racism or homelessness or hunger for the whole world or even the whole town. You just need to take one step of faith at a time. So usually I tend to start with educating yourself. Maybe if reading nonfiction is your thing, then do that, or listen to podcasts or documentary or whatever. Just read some articles on, or like look at local organizations, and just kind of do a little bit of education and see what is one organization or ministry that I can take a step into and just try it.
Yeah.
And if it's a great fit, then you'll find that it's, you can move forward. But like, it just requires the step of faith, and nobody can do that for you except you. But also knowing that God, I tend to, this is probably not good to admit as a pastor, but sometimes I forget that I get so caught up in like what I feel God calling me to do, that I forget that God is actually going to be doing most of the heavy lifting here. And that I get so overwhelmed by like, there's more hungry people. And
but
so
it's
what
a
are we
good
gonna
reminder to take the pressure off of yourself.
It is.
It's like,
and see what God will do.
Yeah.
And like, let God act, leave room for God to act. Don't feel like you have to solve the problem, but just take the one step of faith.
Yeah.
God's not asking you to, run a marathon like right off. It's just one step.
Well, and I used the word called or calling, which I'm now recognizing as a very churchy word to use. But when I'm talking about like feeling called to something, if you see an injustice in the world that fires you up, that you can't stop thinking about, that you can't stop talking about, that you want to learn more about. Yes. And for me, it's fired up. Maybe for you, it makes you cry. I don't know. Whatever your emotional, whatever your emotional reaction is to it, that might be the nudge of like, hey, I want you to step into this world and learn more about it and start doing that social justice work.
Yeah. I think none of us can deny that pang of empathy we feel for the people we encounter who are experiencing homelessness. If you see somebody on the side, like because you sense that humanity. There's just the element of common humanity that you know that there's something not right. Like that person doesn't deserve to have that experience. So maybe for you, that's what it's seeing somebody on the street corner, that's the constant reminder.
It doesn't have to be everything.
Right.
That's where I start to get overwhelmed, is like, there's so much work to be done and everything's wrong and everybody's hurting and all of these things. And here at Trietsch, we believe in giftedness and really focusing on what your gifts are, what it is that you can offer, how you can serve, and what your passions are, following your passion. And that means you don't have to be passionate about everything.
Right. There's somebody else who is. I think the biggest piece of advice is that baby steps, that take it one step at a time. Choose one thing. Don't overwhelm yourself, because I feel the same way. I think that it's that anger triad of the Enneagram that we're like, everything makes me mad. But just start off with one thing and just dedicate to that and just try the one thing.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gracie. I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope to have you on again real soon.
I would love it.
The Life Plus God podcast is hosted, written, and produced by me, Alyssa Robinson, and sponsored by Trietsch Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Check out Trietsch online at tmumc.org or in person to see if this church is a right fit for you and your family. We'd love for you to visit us soon. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and rate us on your podcast platform to help other people find our content. Join us next week, and let's keep growing in relationship with Christ together.